Hi, I'm Dan Katz. I want to talk to you about the role of research software and addressing its challenges as part of the Winter 2024-25 CNI project briefing series. So first, why do we care about research software? We can look at this in terms of funding, where we can see that 20% of NSF projects over an 11-year period topically discuss software in their abstracts, about $10 billion of investment. From the DOE, about 1.2 billion out of a $1.8 billion ECP, exascale computing program activity. We're building and maintaining research software. And in NIH, we can see the amount of money going into projects that are doing software development has been increasing up to about $500 million last year. And additionally, in Australia, it's been shown that about half of the grants given by the Australia Research Council produce software. We can also look at publications where we can see that software-intensive projects are a majority of current publications, and the most cited papers are either methods or software, which is often an implementation of a method. We can ask researchers as well, and when we've done this, we've found that over 90% of US and UK researchers use research software, 65% wouldn't be able to do their research without it, and 50% develop software as part of their research. And finally, the areas in computing and in IT that are really hot today, AI and quantum, both depend on research software. AI really is research software in terms of training and inference, building models and using those models, as well as data cleaning and a bunch of other things around data. And quantum in terms of research into quantum computing and modeling potential quantum systems, as well as programming them, really is research software. So research software, then we can think of in a few different ways. We can think of it as a component of our instruments. We can think of it as the instrument itself, as a tool that analyzes research data, as a tool that presents research results, as something that is assembling or integrating a bunch of components into a working whole, as the infrastructure or the underlying tool, as a way of facilitating research-oriented collaboration, and sometimes research software itself is a research tool for technology research. There's more details on this in the blog post that's down at the bottom. And I should also mention at the very bottom is a DOI that has a link to, that basically contains all of these slides. So given that research software is important to research, here's a vision that I've had for a little while about how this all should work. And that's that all research software that can be is open, and that all research software is high quality and robust, that all research software is findable, accessible, and usable, and it is used by others for their own research. And when it's used, it's also cited. That all contributors to research software are recognized for their work and they have good careers. That all research software is sustained as long as it's useful, and that all research is reproducible. And it's worth mentioning then that all of these are really overlapping in terms of incentives and policies, and that they all start with a recognition of research software. So one of the problems that we have, though, is that software collapses. And this is what this really means is that software stops working eventually if it's not actively maintained. And the structure of computational science stacks, as well as really data science stacks, is that on the bottom, there's some non-scientific infrastructure like operating systems and compilers and support code. On top of that is some scientific infrastructure like libraries and utilities that are useful across multiple disciplines. On top of that is typically, or often at least, multiple discipline-specific software, like multiple tools and libraries that implement disciplinary methods and models. And then on top of that, and finally, is the project-specific software. That's the software that's enabling, that's really doing a computation using building blocks from the lower levels. And it's potentially scripts and workflows and also source codes, libraries, and utilities. The challenge here is that the software is really building and depending on software and all the layers below it, and any change below may cause collapse, whether that's the operating system changing or even below that, the hardware changing. So if we think about this then in terms of challenges, we have the fact that research software is developed and used for the purpose of research. It's increasingly essential in the research process, but there are challenges. Software collapses if it's not maintained. Software bugs are found, new features are needed, new platforms arise. Software development and maintenance is human intensive, at least today. There's some possibility of reducing some of the amount of human work in the future with AI, but it's still a little bit away in terms of at least this part. And then there's also human challenges. Again, a lot of the software that's developed for research is developed by researchers, and those researchers know their disciplines, but they often don't know software best practices. They're often not rewarded for software development and maintenance, at least not in academia. And finally, they typically don't match the diversity of overall society or of user communities. So there's large numbers of people that could be contributing but are not able to. So if I define then research software sustainability, it's the process of developing and maintaining software that continues to meet its purpose over time, including that the software adds new capabilities as needed by its users, responds to bugs and other problems that are discovered, and is ported to work with new versions of the underlying layers, including software as well as new hardware. So there's some ways of addressing this. One is to do things that reduce the amount of work that's needed in terms of maintaining that software. So things like training and best practices and maintaining and developing. We can do things that increase the available resources, like creating incentives so that people want to work on the software, and citations that help in their existing career path are one of those. And I will talk about more about that in one of three parts coming up. New career paths is another one, and I'll talk about that in another piece coming up. We can also increase available funding. If we can make the role of software and research clear to research funders, then we can also make the case for them to increase funding for new software and to fund software maintenance. We can seek institutional resources if software that's developed in an institution is sufficiently important to that institution, and that could be either operationally or reputationally. And then the third thing we can do is to do things that both reduce the amount of work needed and increase the available resources. And one way of doing this is encouraging collaboration. And if software can be designed and developed from the start as modular and reusable and clearly documented and explained to all potential users, and people put effort into engaging and working with that potential user and contributor community, that will start collaborations, or at least will enable them. And we also then need to make the software findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and that's the FAIR acronym that you've probably heard before. And I'll talk about that more in the third little piece that's coming up. So to move on to those three pieces, the first one is software citation. In 2015 to 2016, there was a software citation working group that was formed in Force 11. Force 11 is an organization that's looking at the future of research communication and e-scholarship. The group was co-chaired by Arfin Smith, myself, and Kyle Niemeyer. And what we did was to document the differences between software and data and define software citation challenges. We also created a set of software citation principles over this roughly 18-month period and published those principles. And the principles themselves then are important, that software should be considered a legitimate and citable product of research. Credit and attribution. The citations facilitate giving scholarly credit and normative attribution to all contributors. Unique identification. The software citation should include a method of identification that's machine actionable, globally unique, interoperable, and recognized by a community. Persistence. That the unique identifiers and the metadata about the software should persist even if the software itself goes away. Accessibility. That software citation should facilitate access to the software itself and its metadata, documentation, data, etc. And specificity, that the citation should point to the specific version of the software that was used. Following that, we started a new group to implement the software citation principles, and this ran from 2017 to 2023. Again, I was involved in this along with Neil Chu Hong and Martin Fenner. And what we thought we were going to do initially was to write out the small amount of detail needed to implement the principles and to coordinate what people would do to actually do that, and to work with communities to make sure that happened. But we quickly realized that that small amount of detail wasn't small, and that scattered progress wasn't enough, and that underlying challenges weren't being addressed. And so we wrote a preprint report about what those implementation challenges actually were. And they included, on the technical side, the complexity of software types and identifiers and where to store metadata. And on the social side, the fact that we need groups that work on implementation in context, such as disciplinary communities, publishers, repositories and registries, indexers, funders, and institutions. And we all need them to, in some cases, run pilots by themselves, but then also to come together and to run pilots across these different groups to establish norms within the groups and in a more wide ecosystem sense. In terms of the responses to the challenges, we had a guidance task force that produced guidance for paper authors who want to cite software, a checklist specifically, and a checklist for software developers who want to make their software citable. We had a metadata task force that updated a code meta, a metadata standard, and then moved forward to describe everything in that standard using schema.org properties and turned the group into a community group with a defined governance policy. We had a software registries task force, which developed a best practices document for software for registries and repositories that want to store research software. And this is continuing as a community activity, a consortium of registries and repositories that store scientific software called SciCodes that meets once a month roughly. We had a journals task force that worked with publishers to provide generic guidance for them and conferences as well to customize and then provide to authors. And so we published some work on that, and then Chorus is tracking some of that work in their index. We also provided information to journals on how to handle data and software citations in the production process, because it turned out that a number of issues happened and that data and software citations were being submitted by authors, but they weren't actually making it all the way through the process to indexers. We ran a workshop that looked at progress to date and what else made sense to do, and this was in 2023, I believe, and wrote a report at the end of that process. And the working group then ended in May of 2023, but the community still has people who are interested in continued discussion. And there's a new task force from the Research Software Alliance, or RISA, on fair software practices, and this task force has overlapping interest, and so some discussion is moving there. Second of three topics then is research software engineers. And so again, I talked a little bit about where research software comes from. It's a significant fraction is discovered and developed in research. This has happened from the beginning of computing. It seems like software as an idea appeared around 1948, and research software, particularly in weather, started just a couple of years later. Software engineering started in the late 1960s, and it was mostly applied to operational software at that point. As I mentioned again earlier, researchers, particularly faculty, often don't know good software practices. There are software engineers who know good software practices, but they often don't understand the context of research. And there are students and postdocs who kind of fit into the middle of this. Initially, they don't know good software practices, and even worse, they don't often stick around, they move on. Some of them do stay, some postdocs in particular. Sometimes they join the staff of an institution. They may become staff members, or maybe they're joining unofficially and they're just staying as postdocs for a really long time. And so we do get to the point eventually where we do have some staff that understand research and have software engineering skills. And this has been looked at from a blog post that looked at the craftsperson and the scholar as two alternative ways of looking at how work is done. This defined the scholar as the archetypical researcher who's driven to understand things to their fullest capability. This person finds intellectually demanding problems, and they do curiosity-driven work and on a topic until they really understand it, and then they pass on that understanding through teaching. On the other side is the craftsperson who is driven to create and leave behind an artifact that explains their effort in a field. And this is a person who feels pain when they make something that's fragile or ugly. They prefer to make things that explain themselves. And this kind of work requires patience and pride in doing a job well. And scientific software, as I was talking about on the previous slide, really requires individuals who combine the best of both roles. I want to point out that this came out in 2012, this blog post. So this is not a new concept. This is something that's been developed over a little while at this point. And so we can think of a research software engineer then as somebody that is in between software engineering and research. If we think of this as two axes defining a space, we have a researcher who's really good at research but doesn't really know much software engineering, and a software engineer who's really good at software engineering but doesn't know much about research. And we have researcher developers who are quite good at research and also understand a fair amount of software engineering. And research software engineers then are fitting a little bit more in the middle of this, a bit better software engineering experience and potentially a bit less research experience, particularly in a given domain. But these are people that fit into a cloud. This is not just a point. And so some have more software engineering experience, some have more research experience in a given discipline. In 2012, there was a workshop in the United Kingdom called the Collaborations Workshop, where they discovered that there were a lot of people already doing this kind of work, but they didn't have a common title. And in fact, they had 194 different job titles in UK universities. And the people in this workshop agreed that research software engineer, RSE, would be the title that they would use going forward, not because it was ideal, but because everybody agreed with it. And it was better to have something that was agreed to than not. There was no community of these people at this point, and so the collaborations workshop decided to start creating an association, and that then led into societies and multiple associations. And this wasn't seen as a profession, and so there was the need then to build career path and to build structure around this kind of work. In the 12 years since then, there has been a lot of work. The movement and term, again, born in the UK. In 2013, the UK RSE Association formed with about 50 members, and this is now a society, a nonprofit, with about 700 dues-paying members and about 6,200 people in the community overall. There also are communities that have formed in Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, the Nordic countries, Australia, New Zealand, and in the US as well. US RSE now has about 3,000 members across universities, national labs, and industry. There's also an activity called Devlog that's in France that actually started in 2011 that I would say is RSE-like, but because it started before the RSE movement, it's a little bit different as well. And there are new associations now forming in Africa and Asia, as well as in Canada. And these associations work on local issues, they work collectively, and they can coordinate across countries and across regions when needed. Okay, the third and last thing that I'm going to talk about then is FAIR for research software. You're probably familiar with the FAIR principles. In 2016, this paper came out on the FAIR principles, and it said that they were intended to apply to all research objects, both those used in research and those that are research outputs. And again, FAIR is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. The text and the principles themselves often included the term metadata, meta in parentheses, and this was shorthand for metadata and data to make the principles fairly compact. And the principles are applied via dataset creators and repositories. They're collectively responsible for creating, annotating, indexing, preserving, and sharing the datasets and their metadata. And the way that this is done assumes that there are separate and sequential creator and publisher roles. Right? Somebody creates a data set, they turn it over along with metadata to a publisher, and the publisher then does its work. But if we think about non-data objects, they can often be stored as data, but they're not just data. The high-level goals, again, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, are mostly the same, but the details and how they're implemented depend on how those objects are created and used, how and where the objects are stored and shared, and how and where metadata is stored and indexed. And again, the argument that we've made is that these are not the case for software as they are for data. And so we believe then there was work needed to define and implement and adopt principles, FAIR principles in particular for research software. Others agree with this. As I said, the principles were intended to apply to all objects, but in the FAIR Practice Task Force in EASC in 2020, one of the recommendations was to recognize that FAIR guidelines require translation for other digital objects, and that EASC should support that. And in the French National Committee for Open Sciences, Free Software and Open Source Project Group, one of their recommendations was to make sure the specific nature of software is recognized and it's not just considered as just data, particularly in the context of discussion about FAIR data. So in our working group, we focused on adaptation and adoption of the FAIR principles to research software. Again, software and data are different, and just to mention a little bit of the reasons for this, software is data, but it's not just data. Software is executable, data is not. Data provides evidence, and software provides a tool. Software is creative work, and scientific data are typically facts and observations, and this leads legally into different licensing and copyright practices across multiple countries, but there almost always are differences for the two. Software suffers from collapse, which is different than the bit rot that data suffers from. The lifetime of software is generally not as long as that of data. And maybe most importantly, for open source software, there is no natural sequential creator and publisher process, and there's no natural publisher. right? Software is developed in the open, potentially on GitHub, and so it is developed and used as it's developed without a publisher being involved. And there is not a reason for software on GitHub, for example, to be sent to a archival repository, even though GitHub is not archival. So the FAIR for Research Software group then defined a consensus set of FAIR principles for research software. There were 9 of us that led this group. We did this under Force 11 that I've previously mentioned, under the Research Data Alliance and under the Research Software Alliance, RISA. We first defined research software as including source code files, algorithms, and scripts and workflows and executables that were developed or created during the research process or for a research purpose. There are additional software components like operating systems and libraries and other things that are used for research, but if they were not created during or with a clear research intent, they should be considered software in research and not research software. But this differentiation varies between disciplines. So just to give an example of this, if I'm a computational chemist and I'm using a compiler to compile my code, for me, that compiler is software in research, but not research software. But if I'm a computer scientist and my research is developing compilers or working on programming languages, that compiler is research software for me. So again, we developed in 2022 a set of FAIR for Research software principles. I won't talk about these in great detail, but I'll just mention that the parts in italics are the parts that are significantly different than the FAIR principles for research software. And so in terms of findability, there's differences related to the fact that software granularity and software versions are key elements of software in a way that is not the same for all data. Accessibility is very similar. Interoperability is quite different because we really had to define what interoperability and reusability mean. And the way we define those in software was not, didn't naturally follow from data. So we made a choice to define interoperability for software as the way that software interoperates with other software through exchanging data and metadata, or through interaction through APIs described through standards. And reusability we defined as first usability, that the software can actually be executed as well as read, and reusability being that it can be understood, modified, built upon, and incorporated into other software. So this leads to some differences from the FAIR data principles. We also defined a governance process for FAIR for research software because there was no governance process defined as part of the original FAIR principles for data, and that turned out to be an issue. And so that governance includes interpretation and future revisions, and we turned that over to the RDA Software Source Code Interest Group. We did an initial survey of adoption guidelines at the point of creating the principles, and an initial study of adopting organizations to understand why people were doing this and how they were doing it. 2 years in, and this year, we did a 2-year adoption report, and we also are now doing a 2-year principles review. And there's a survey that's available, and if you are using the FAIR principles or you've looked at them and decided not to use them, we'd be really interested in your feedback about what's been good, what's been bad, what's been easy, what's been hard, things like that. The survey will be open at least through the end of February, and then in March we'll review it and try to figure out what to do next, which could include updating the principles or creating additional documentation around them. But if nothing else, we'll include deciding when to do another review. There's work needed to go from principles, which are general statements, to tools and practices, which are actually what developers need, and that's increasingly happening. Again, I mentioned that there's a new RISA task force on that. And then finally, FAIR for RS exposes a bunch of ecosystem gaps, particularly related to metadata and archiving and versioning. As I said, the creator-publisher sequence typically doesn't apply for research software. We have questions about where metadata should be stored, where code should be archived, and the fact that versioning is complicated, where different use cases in some may need a specific version of the software or the latest version or all versions. And then finally, there's a lot of work beyond FAIR. So FAIR doesn't say anything about the quality of the software, the correctness of the software, the reproducibility of using the software, or the openness of the software. And all of those are important to move forward towards this vision of open source and open science and better research. So finally, I've mentioned the Research Software Alliance a couple of times. I just want to mention a little bit about it as I wrap up. So the Research Software Alliance has a vision that research software and those who develop and maintain it are recognized and valued as fundamental and vital to research worldwide. And its mission is to advance the research software ecosystem by collaborating with key influencers and decision makers. RISA was founded in 2019, and it's fiscally sponsored by Code for Science and Society. And what RISA has done includes co-developing the FAIR for Research Software Principles, supporting the current 2-year review, and working on actionable guidelines for making research software fair. RISA also did some work around best practices for equity, diversity, and inclusion. It worked on mapping the global international research software community landscape, gathering global research software funders to set an agenda for sustainable research software, which led to the Adore.Software Declaration, the Amsterdam Declaration on Funding Research Software Sustainability, which is at Adore.Software, that's a URL. We're gathering research software infrastructure organizations to talk about their interoperability. We co-wrote a position paper on research software and AI. We've examined policies at research performing organizations that include software, and that's called Pro4RS. That's another Research Data Alliance RISA working group. And we're collaborating in task forces on specific issues that affect the global research software community, including new task force on fair software practices that I've mentioned a couple of times. If you're interested in RISA, you can sign up to receive our newsletter. You can join the RISA Slack. You can add to our database of research software funding calls, and you can join task forces focused on specific activities. So overall, where we are now is that research software is increasingly important to research. Citation is the accepted mechanism for scholarly credit in academia, at least, and software citation is starting to become accepted with uptake from researchers, publishers, librarians, and others. Software papers are potentially a placeholder for software citation, but they also have an important community function. Research software engineers were recently recognized as a role but have a long history, and we're now building community around them and making a case for formal career paths. The FAIR data principles set out a good goal to share data to enhance and enable and enhance reuse. And there was work that was needed to apply this to research software, both open source and not, to fulfill open science concepts. And we created those FAIR for Research software principles with about 500 people and about 60 events, with guidance and adoption examples and governance, and 2 years of progress so far. And we are now trying to widen adoption and review the principles. So what you can do includes promoting software sharing and credit. So if you're an author or work with authors, you can cite the software that's being used. When you develop software, you work with developers, make sure that the software is easy to cite. When you review, demand that software be cited. If you develop software, support its development, make it fair, follow the FAIR for Research software principles. Support RSEs by supporting software developers and maintainers. Think about how your organization does this now and if you can change it, whether those people are faculty members or staff or students or anything else. You can see the US RSE website or the Society of RSE in the UK for information on how different groups are doing this. You can work to make sure that software work is included in hiring and promotion for everyone. Open science and open software and FAIR and the software source code interest group and the research software engineering group and the Research Software Alliance are all open communities, and you can join one of them. And overall, I think the final message that I'd like to leave is to try to work to raise the awareness of research software as a key element of research. Research software is not papers, it's not data, it's not business software. It has different goals, incentives, methods, practices, workforce, and education. And awareness that these are different is the first thing that's really needed in order to make research software better and to lead to better research. So I'll wrap up there. I just want to thank a number of people for co-leadership in different groups, as well as for discussions, and say that I write some blog posts occasionally, and I am mostly active on Mastodon, although a little bit on Blue Sky as well in the same place. So thank you very much for your attention, and if you have questions, be happy to talk further through email or through any other means that are necessary. Thanks very much. Bye.